Science is not a method, the philosophy of science. Unfortunately, science has become politicized. We're constantly hit over the head with the trust the science, scientific consensus. Scientists say, but most people, including most scientists, have no idea what science is. There's been an attempt to wrap science into a nice little bow called the scientific method. So you don't have to think about the philosophy of science. But it's obvious that the scientific method does not apply to all sciences. For instance, in biology, most of it doesn't involve experiments. Neither does astronomy or geology. But it fits a narrative that puts everything into a little package with a nice little bow for people. I investigated who was the first person to push the idea of the scientific method. It turns out it was Reverend William Whewell, who was an English polymath and did some groundbreaking work on recording and studying tides. Reverend Whewell was a fan of Immanuel Kant, and he was opposed to the ideas of the British empiricists. He adopted Kant's idea of a priori knowledge. A priori knowledge is knowledge that we are born with. It's inherent, it's not subject to experiments or observation. This is not surprising, as Whewell was a reverend, and the whole point of Kant's epistemology was to save religion from science. A priori knowledge is an artifact of Plato's ideal world, which is where Christian heaven comes from. This is completely inconsistent with Enlightenment science. Whewell argued that the principles of science, such as the laws of nature, are not merely inductive generalizations from experience, but are necessary truths that are known a priori. Whewell saw these necessary truths as the result of the mind's active role in organizing and interpreting sensory data, which aligns with Kant's view of a mind-constructive role in experience. In other words, we don't just observe nature, we create nature in our own minds, which is called transcendental idealism in philosophy. I would say Whewell was part of the philosophical tradition of undermining science to save religion, which includes Immanuel Kant, Hegel, and Popper. The goal of these anti-Enlightenment philosophers is to make people think that philosophy has nothing at all to do with science. These same people forget that the original name for science was natural philosophy, and they forget that a PhD is a doctorate in philosophy. These philosophers have so polluted the philosophy of science with irrationalism that most people now think science has nothing to do with philosophy. As this quote from Richard Feynman shows, who is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, he states, "The philosophy of science is about as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds." He also said, "Philosophers say a great deal about what is absolutely necessary for science, and it's always, so far as one can see, rather naive and probably wrong." So basically, Feynman is saying that science has evolved beyond philosophy, which I think is a common point of view. But unfortunately, the reason for this point of view is that the mainstream philosophical thoughts on science became divorced from the original Enlightenment experiment, which is why I think Feynman was so disdainful of the philosophy of science. It is also because the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics is completely inconsistent with the concepts of the philosophy of science. One of the things that is forgotten in this day and age of using science as a political bludgeon is that science has an ethics. It is not just epistemology and metaphysics. And the number one rule of ethics in science is that you have to report the data honestly, which disqualifies so many areas of science like the recent COVID bullshit and the global warming nonsense. In addition to this nonsense, a number of mathematicians and physicists and others are pushing the idea of mathematical Platonism, which is the idea that mathematics is metaphysics. I did a whole video on mathematical Platonism. Another attack on the philosophy of science is known in philosophy as collective idealism. Collective idealism posits the idea that shared consciousness or the collective mind of a group influences or even creates the reality experience of its members. Sounds a lot like scientific consensus to me, which, by the way, if anyone ever uses the term scientific consensus, they're not a scientist. They have no idea what science is. With that introduction of how the philosophy of science and science itself is under attack by modern philosophers and academics, let's turn to what is the correct philosophy of science. Of course, this is a huge topic, so this will be a brief introduction. The foundation of science is the law of identity, stated as A is A. This law of identity is critical to eliminating superstition, was first explained by Aristotle. The law of identity means that things exist, that they have certain properties, that they always act in accordance with these properties, and A does not suddenly become B without reason. Science is also built on the law of non-contradiction, which I think follows directly from the law of identity, and is often explained as something cannot be both A and non-A simultaneously. Science is also built on the idea of the law of excluded middle, which states that A and not A make up the whole universe of possibilities. You will see people constantly try to weasel out of this basic rule of logic. Science is the study of natural phenomena and an attempt to understand this phenomena. The ultimate arbiter of truth in science is reality. What does the data show? We can trust the data because of the law of causality. Things act according to their principles. Things have certain properties. They can't suddenly transform themselves like ancient superstitions or gods. They are what they are, and therefore they have properties, and those properties cannot change for no reason. Thus, experimentation is a valid process to obtain knowledge. Since things have to act in accordance with their nature, we can do experiments to isolate things, find out what the causes are and what are the effects. Something that is constantly confused in economics. For instance, where Keynesians suggest that consumption causes production. Despite this, some people push the idiocy of David Hume, who said that things just follow one another, that there is no cause and effect. The fact that people bought this David Hume crap is insane.
But why do you call them shit?
Because they are shit.
But science cannot always rely on experiments. For instance, there's no way to recreate the universe and the Big Bang Theory. Therefore, we have to rely on observation, which is also true in much of geology and much of biology. Science is based on both deductive and inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is how we build general principles. Deductive reasoning is how we use those principles to discover new knowledge, such as Newton's law of gravity, which was the first explanation for why there are 2 tides per day. One of the philosophers of science who became popular and was pushed by the mainstream media is Karl Popper. He's commonly quoted for the idea that any scientific theory has to be falsifiable. But his philosophy of science makes the mistake of requiring perfect knowledge. This mistake leads to his idea that all of science, or at least a scientific theory, could be overturned by just one experiment. Just a single experiment could prove all of Newton's ideas completely invalid. This shows a complete lack of understanding of science. A scientific theory is something that collects a bunch of facts into one coherent concept, and having one experiment fail outside of this theory does not undermine the whole theory. I think people love to push Popper in order to undermine the power and the validity of science and reason, or at least make it appear very fragile. What Popper doesn't understand or is purposely ignoring is that all of knowledge is contextual. There's no such thing as perfect knowledge. Perfect knowledge would mean that you know everything. You're omniscient. An example of how this applies is that when construction companies are building a house or building a building, they assume that the earth is flat even though they know the earth is actually a sphere. Popper would say they're making a mistake, but in fact, because knowledge is contextual within the context of building a house or a building, assuming the earth is flat is perfectly valid. It's not an error, and of course the earth is not a sphere either. It's not a spheroid either, it's a bumpy spheroid at best. Pushing perfect knowledge is designed to undermine your confidence in reason and science. Modern philosophers are also trying to push the idea of collective idealism or social constructivism, which is the idea that somehow our mind, particularly the mind of the collective group, can create reality, which is the exact opposite of science. This also undermines the whole scientific project from the Enlightenment. We see the evidence of this in the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which not only denies the law of identity and the law of causality, but has this idea that things only happen if they're observed, which is the opposite of science. Science is about the study of natural phenomena, and science is about understanding that our mind does not cause things to happen. We don't have telepathy, we don't have telekinesis. This is all pseudoscience bullshit, and this is just a fancy philosophical version of it. A couple of other random misconceptions that I would like to clear up in this video are: a scientist is not somebody that has the title of science in their name. A scientist is also not someone who does peer-reviewed research. Peer review, by the way, is not scientific. That's scientific consensus. A little-known fact is that both Newton and Galileo were rejected by their peers. Anyone who follows the philosophy of science in order to discover knowledge is doing science. They are a scientist. It doesn't matter what their title is or what their education is. Also, there seems to be a lot of confusion as to what the difference is between science and engineering. Science is the study of natural phenomena. Engineering is the application of scientific knowledge and practical knowledge to solve actual problems and to create real things that improve our lives, such as buildings, bridges, x-ray machines, rockets, the internet, etc. In many ways, engineers today are much more scientific than most so-called scientists. If you look at the totality of Malay's speeches, he definitely seems to understand the difference between Enlightenment science and the nonsense that's going on today, such as mathematical Platonism, which he has talked about indirectly in a number of his speeches. Having a proper understanding of science and not undermining it is key to freedom, because freedom is built on reason. Long live freedom, damn it.